Okay, so I have even more slides today, but I actually shortened it to a little mini presentation. There's only 10 or 12, so I'm hoping these slides are going to be jumping off points for us to have more discussion this time around. Last time was a bit of an in-depth, I think somebody described it as a kind of a explosion or fountain of discourse. And in some ways, it's very hard to communicate Gebser without recalibrating, right? There's so much context and language and unique framing that Gebser offers. We kind of have to swim in it. And so for those of you who feel a bit drenched from wading through the thick waters of Gebser's writing and insights, I encourage you just to sort of ambiently soak it up, soak it in. It starts to have an effect on you in an indirect way. Just a few notes. I just placed in the chat a few things. I'll repost them just in case everybody, new folks are logging in right now, and I'll post this again later. But just some heads up information. There is a course that's starting where we're basically going to be going through the ever-present origin, not reading it cover to cover, but we are going to be going through this book for 2 months, starting March 7th. And that's going to be a deep dive where basically it'll be part lecture, part Q&A. There will be a collective presencing inspired session to complement the lectures, to really deep dive experientially the structures of consciousness. So if you're curious about this, if this has intrigued you, definitely feel free to check out the course info there. And I also have some of my other contacts. So if you want to reach out for a question, my email's there in the chat, Twitter is there, and then my newsletter if you'd like to sign up for that. So different ways to connect with me in and through between now and the course. So with that being said, let me get the slides back up here. So can everybody see my screen here? You see slides? Okay, excellent. And if I hit play, we still see it? Excellent, excellent. Okay, so part 2, as it were, shaped by tomorrow, the presence of the future. This is that what I was just speaking of before we hit record, the sense of integral transmission, a spiritual transmission, or even a sort of intuitive transmission that I was feeling from Gebser way back in the day in undergrad times for me, 15, 16 years ago. This sense that Gebser's unique insights into the nature of time and how integral consciousness had to do with time, but uniquely this, and I'll open up with our first slide here, this statement. And Gebser repeats this in many different ways and draws this out from many different poets and artists and writers that he looks at throughout Ever-Present Origin and his other works. The presence of the future in the present. And here's what he says here. The present is not identical with the moment, but is the undivided presence of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, which in a consciously realized actualization can lead to that, this is one of Gebser's terms, presentiation, which encompasses origin as an ineradicable present. So this is the way Gebser opens up EPO, this statement that origin and the present are in some sense an open form of time, where the past and the future are interrelated in the living present, right? And part of the implicit spiritual practice in Gebser's writing, if we were to read through it as a spiritual text, is to turn towards the present, so that it becomes diaphanous to the past and the future, transparent, in other words, to what is latent in the present, which is both the living past. And then also, this is the kind of fun sci-fi element to it in some ways, if we start to play around with these possibilities, the presence of the future. This idea that the future is co-shaping us in the same way that the past definitively shapes us, our ancestral histories, right? Trauma, but also positive things. Nora Bateson has this term, aphanopoiesis, which is how things coalesce towards wholeness and wellness, right? Towards aliveness. This is the living present that Gebser's speaking to. And the transparent present that he felt, at least, was a kind of consciousness that was coming online or coming to the fore, as it were, in the history of consciousness. And this just to kind of like recap what we were talking about last week too, or last session, this movement from space to time is really what defines for Gebser the integral mutation as a differentiation from the mental structure of consciousness, which we have sort of been in, rolling around in for the past 3,000 years or so, more and more and more so as we move towards the present. We have an intensification of the mental structure, but we also have the beginnings, the latent beginnings of the integral structure. And Gebser's so good at this. Part of the course, what we're going to be doing is looking really at Gebser's initial terminology for all of this stuff, which he keeps in ever-present origin. The unperspectival world, right? The lack of perspective, the two-dimensional magic mythic, right? The enchanted infused cosmos in which we are in participation with what is above, right? As above, so below. As above, so below. The interrelatedness, the participation in a living cosmology, that begins to break open with the realization of space. And it's so easy to do this, especially if we look at, I think from a Western perspective, we like to talk about ourselves, right? We like to talk about the history of the West and the birth of humanism. So there's a lot of context that we can draw from, at the very least, for European cultures making this particular movement into the perspectival world. But it's the arising of perspective, of three-dimensional space as its own thing. And I have these Giotto paintings here that I use often in the class to sort of denote this subtle transformation. We still have these mythic images of an enchanted cosmos, but we have the arising of perspective. There's depth, right? There's a field of depth in this image. On the left-hand side, you see the kind of allegorical image of Adam and Eve being banished from Eden, right? So there's a kind of archetypal cosmos that's still present here. But in this one, you can see the shift, actually, where it seems like it could be anyone's backyard. There's a fence back there. There's the sort of a shrinking away of the enchanted cosmos as it withdraws into the self, right? Into the ego. Richard Tarnas talks about this quite a bit, but it's being replaced by the spatialization of the world. And we talked about that last time too, all of these interesting humanists and Renaissance thinkers beginning to develop this sense of selfhood, which hadn't really existed in prior epochs, this sense of the buffered self, like Charles Taylor talks about, that is somewhat insulated from a participatory cosmos, right? And emancipated in some ways, right? Our own autonomy and differentiation begins to be emphasized in this time. Many of these thinkers and philosophers really of their time were lens crafters as well. I'm thinking of like Galileo or Copernicus, et cetera. So there's this spatialization of the cosmos, which begins to take place. And this is really the kind of foundation for, which we were talking about last session as well, the birth of the perspectival world, the emergence of modernity, the capacity to have that Cartesian ego that separates self and world and stands apart from the world in order to measure it, right? To have stepping out to claim our own space. The negative side of this has been, of course, colonization, right? The material expansion of the globe, right? The mastery of technological innovation, which helped us spread all over the place. The globe moves from sort of a flat thing to a round perspectival Cartesian grid. This is the perspectival world, which is now being broken open. And for Gebser, this is the birth of the aperspectival world. So we have three: the unperspectival, the perspectival, which we have been in and is sort of breaking apart presently, and the aperspectival. And the A for Gebser, as we talked a little bit about last time in the Q&A, it doesn't so much mean a complete lack of perspective. A for Gebser is the prefix alpha privativum, which is freedom for and freedom from. So it's not the loss of perspective, it's the freedom for and the freedom from perspective. We're no longer locked into the spatialized cosmos. And in fact, the spatialized cosmos is going through its own reckoning in the same way the medieval cosmos sort of became ruptured by this emergence of space. Now, in our context, the perspectival spatial world, the Cartesian cosmos, is being broken open by time rather than space. And I have this up here, and I always use these guys for for my class, just as a good example, I forget if you want the artist names for each of these, I have them in my notes, but most of them are Italian artists, so appropriate to kind of jump from the Italian Renaissance to these Italian futurists in the early 20th century. But what we have, and this is what Gebser begins to describe, is this eruption or the breaking forth of time. We'll get into that in a moment. But an emerging consciousness of time and movement is also what begins to have an incipient, what exactly to say it, an incipient theme in modernity. We're going somewhere is one form of time, the sense of progress, the sense of development, the sense of history moving faster and faster. Technology helping to shrink space, right? To overcome the vast distances of space as things move faster and faster. For Gebser, this is only one form of time, but it's the form of time that is probably most appropriate for modernity and understanding it. So we have in many of these artists in the early 20th century, an attempt to realize this new consciousness pressing upon them. I like to give this example in my class as well, that what exactly does Gebser mean by a new mutation? What is the felt sense of it? And I think it's very much like an artist might feel, a felt sense of something pressing upon our consciousness to be given form, right? There's a latent urgency to bring forth something. I think a lot of artists in the early 20th century and artists today are possessed by this new sense of self and world, this new sense of space and time, which is breaking forth in us. And so a lot of the Italian futurists, as you can see, I love this particular image because it harkens back to unperspectival painting, let's say like Paleolithic cave art, which denotes a kind of movement and multidimensionality. We have an interesting return to that here, where this is, if you can't quite see it, it's clearly a kind of person on a horse with a lance and in some kind of battle. A lot of the futurists were sort of flirting with nationalism and some of them with fascism. And some of them simply just the glorification of speed, which became a kind of idolization for them, right? That kind of celebration of modern technology. But I bring it up because, and here's a few other examples, there was this rapid sense of a transforming world, a world burst open by time, right? Movement and speed, motoricity and technology, they all became sort of commingled in the early 20th century. Gebser particularly looks at, I don't have Picasso's work up here just for brevity's sake for us today, but Gebser spends some time in the early pages of Ever-Present Origin looking at Picasso's work. The multidimensionality of the figures in Picasso's art denotes a kind of movement, a looking forward, a looking sideways. It's as if you see somebody moving through time at a glance. This perceptual sense of movement through time at a glance in the present, right? As a past, present, and future, kind of shifting and morphing in the present in our senses is touching a bit on what Gebser means by this integral mutation. So there's a few issues with this though. As we talked about last time as well, there is this sense of overwhelm that we tend to have when we begin to explore temporics, when we begin to explore time. And for Gebser, the integral structure in the aperspectival world is a very complex relationship with time. And I'll just read this as a kind of an example, and I use this in class quite often too. Gebser says this: to the perception of the aperspectival world, time appears to be the very fundamental function and to be of a most complex nature. It manifests itself in accordance with a given consciousness structure and the appropriate possibility of manifestation in its aspects as, and here's the list, clock time, right? That's what we're very familiar with. Natural time, cosmic or sidereal time, biological duration, rhythm, meter, as mutation, discontinuity, relativity, I think he's speaking to Einstein there, as vital dynamics, psychic energy, and thus in a certain sense in the form we call soul and the unconscious, right? There's a kind of residual past that our dream life and our psychic life shows us, right? The unconscious helps us connect with these layers of our psychic history. And as mental dividing, right? Clock time again, past, present, future, even as a conceptual dividing. It manifests itself as the unity of past, present, and future, as the creative principle, the power of imagination, as work, and even as motoricity. And along with the vital psychic, biological, cosmic, rational, creative, sociological, and technical aspects of time, we must include, last but not least, physical geometric time, which is designated as the fourth dimension. So a lot of us talk about three-dimensional space, four-dimensional time. Gebser is very interested in all of these. And what he's showing us here is not just a random assortment of things, but a complex, right? In the way that Edgar Morin talks about complex. Time is a complex phenomena. It expresses itself in different ways. It's almost a kind of multifaceted jewel, as it were. It's slowness, but it's also fastness. It's the past, but it's also the future. It shows up as the machine time of our very modern centric, technocentric world, which is obsessed with punctuality and getting things faster or getting more money next year, right? There's that kind of progressive movement forward, but it's also the movement back. And Gebser saying it's all of these things. If we can hold all of this as a sort of complex image, and that's why I have this complex image in the background here. Time is a complex tapestry. It's a complex weave of different threads, which together create the present, right? And there's a gentle leaning into the present that I think is also here in Gebser's more spiritual writings, where it's not as overwhelming, because when it comes down to it, Gebser's mandate, if he has one, and a contemplative injunction, is to turn again and again towards the present, the intensity of the present, the openness of the present, and the presence of this complexity of time, which is available to us. So I want to bring up one of these concepts, one more of these concepts for us. I mentioned this a little bit already, sorry. But the breaking forth of time for Gebser, I think is one of the essential concepts for us. And he points this to be right around the time of the French Revolution. If we were going to historicize this mutation of the integral structure, when does it begin? Well, for Gebser, he says there's this particular historical moment right around then when both the arising of the left, right, political movements, revolution, and also the innovations of technology all are happening around the same moment. This is really interesting because Paul Crutzen, the geologist who coined the term Anthropocene, points to James Watt's invention of the steam engine, right, the utilization of coal, as the beginning of the Anthropocene. Tim Morton, who's a fun eco-philosopher, also points to this moment, right, as a very interesting moment, the birth, as he says, of hyper objects. And some folks have talked about hyper objects and climate change, I think, in our circles. So there's a specialness to this moment. I think it's interesting that Gebser also points to it as well, right? But as I think we mentioned this earlier, like time is not an avenue, right? So there's a particular problematic relationship we as moderns have with time. We're deeply spatialized and Cartesian, and yet our attempt to master time is through this sort of mapping and categorizing and attempting to control within spatializing limits, within the spatializing world. But what ends up happening is a kind of interesting dialogical process where time as an intensity in its complexity keeps breaking out of our systems, right? We attempt to master and harness the forces of time, but time pushes back. It breaks open our systems. It speeds and intensifies things. Moderns as a phenomena are helpless in relationship to time. A lot of folks talk about this in the 20th century. Walter Benjamin speaking to the nightmare of history, right? There's the sense of history as this intensifying catastrophe. Gebser speaks of this quite often as the modern phrase, the all too modern perspectival phrase that I have no time. And when we say we have no time, we're really saying we have no soul. We have no time for ensoulment. We have no time to be present. For Gebser, this is a hallmark of a kind of deficient, as we talked about last time, when a structure of consciousness it isn't able to adapt and open up to the emergent structure. It has a deficient relationship, right? It's attempting to capture the new consciousness within the structure of the old. So because of this, we have this sort of push-pull across the last few hundred years of modernity, speeding up, intensifying, and then finally, in some sense, especially today, a sense of haplessness, a sense that we can't slow down, right? This is a lot of the time anxiety around the climate crisis, the sense of nostalgia, right? This mourning for the future, which is a very temporal experience and theme as well. And I want to bring all this up to kind of contextualize our own moment here, and how this is one of the reasons why I've been following this Gebser track for the past few years. I'm really interested in the insights that Gebser might be able to give us with this crisis of time, which so signifies and characterizes modernity, late modernity. Let me see if I can go back here. Okay. And let me just quickly switch one thing. Okay. There we go. So this is from a contemporary writer, but I love this quote and I use this very often. Some of you are probably already familiar with it if you're attending from my classes. This is from Andreas Malm's book called The Progress of the Storm, Nature and Society in a Warming Climate. And I love this because this sort of helps us to situate ourselves and the thematics of time in our contemporary culture becoming even more important than ever before, even more important in Gebser's time. Time has become such a theme for the crisis of the climate crisis, economic crisis, the meta crisis, as it were. And I'll just mention the whole quote because I didn't put it all on here. But just to kind of let us feel into the conditions, the sort of base conditions that we experience in the 21st century are very temporal without us even realizing it, right? Without us even really thinking about how much time is a theme. But this is Andreas Malm, and he says, global warming is a result of actions in the past. Every molecule of CO2 above the pre-industrial level resides in the atmosphere because humans have burnt trees and other plants, preponderantly fossil fuels over the course of time. In the beginning, the carbon in coal and natural gas was locked into the crust of the earth. Then at some point, those reserves were located and exploited and the fuels delivered to fireplaces, whence the carbon was released as CO2. And here's the interesting point where he's saying, at any given moment, the excess of heat in the Earth's system is the sum of all those historical fires. Just really feel into that, right? The strange weather that we experience these days is the sum of all of those historical fires, right? There's a sense of our ancestors being present in that statement. Okay, and then he continues, of the cumulative emissions, the pulses of CO2 stacked on top of each other, the storm of climate change draws its force from countless acts of combustion over, to be exact, the past 2 centuries. We can never be in the heat of the moment, only in the heat of this ongoing past. So there's a way in which we can experience time very often first as an eruption of the past, right? The presence of the past weighing upon us is one introduction to time, right? But only one form, but very often the easier one, right? With our own memory, with historical instances like this, etc. So he says, insofar as extreme weather is shaped by basal warming, it is the legacy of what people have done, the latest leakage from a malign capsule. And then this line, indeed, the air is heavy with time. And I find that to be, I joke that, Gebser occasionally will quote somebody in his book and an EPO and leave an exclamation point next to a particular author who's saying something that just almost is in Gebser's words. And I would say this, indeed, the air is heavy with time is such a Gebserian statement. And now he says this, and this is also speaks to the intensification, the felt sense of a warming condition that we live in today. Now more than ever, we inhabit the diachronic, the discordant, the inchoate. The fossil fuels, hundreds of millions of years old, the mass combustion developed over the past 2 centuries, the extreme weather this has already generated, a journey towards a future that will be infinitely more extreme unless something is done now, right? That urgency is a temporal theme, again, a felt sense, something needing to be done now. The tale of present emissions stretching into the distance. History has sprung alive through a nature that has done likewise. We are only in the very early stages, but already our daily life, our psychic experience, our cultural responses, even our politics show signs of being sucked back by planetary forces into the whole of time. And I like that. There's almost a pun with that, whole, H-O-L-E, but it could be the wholeness of time, right? The entirety of time. the present dissolving into past and future alike. Postmodernity seems to be visited by its antithesis, a condition of time and nature conquering ever more space. Call it the warming condition. And just to kind of switch back to this slide, I'm bringing up the kind of negative prerequisites, right? The integral consciousness showing up, this wholeness of time, the interrelationship of past, present, and future, showing up first in a kind of negative expression of itself. This is something one of my favorite thinkers, integral thinkers, Wilber and Thompson had wrote, that the emergent consciousness often shows up as a kind of crisis for the old one, right? The kind of crisis for the collapsing structure or worldview. And so I think the integral structure is showing up for us absolutely everywhere as this theme of time, a crisis to be resolved, a form of consciousness to be mastered, but it can only be done by turning towards a new relationship with time, right? Which is learning the complexity and living that complexity of time in our daily lives through a new kind of openness and spaciousness, which is obviously much easier said than done. But everywhere, as Gebser says in that last quote, right, we see this theme of time pressing upon our consciousness. And technology has been one of the great phenomena that expresses it as a kind of intensifying of progress and development, and also the crises that those bring about. And of course, that's commingling with the economic crisis and the climate crisis as a sort of yearning to master time, right? A demand to turn towards time in a new relationship. So all this to say, if I can get out of my, if I can get out of here, I want to open it up. I know we were going for about half an hour, and I'll come back to those slides shortly. But how are we doing so far? Been a bit of a whirlwind once again. But I'm conscious of inviting in a bit more Q&A this time, maybe some initial questions before we make any other points. And feel free to just jump in, raise your hand. And this might be a good prompt too. When it comes to temporics, it seems abstract at first. What does Gebser mean by time? But then all of a sudden, I hope that this presentation is helping us get a sense that, wait a second, I'm living this every day. And the kind of global experience of anxiety around time, the sense of the past, the sense of the future is something that is becoming increasingly the sea in which we swim, right? The atmosphere in which we breathe as a sort of cultural context. And this, again, is exactly what Gebser is looking at with the structures. They are this is to borrow from some of Charles Taylor's framing, a kind of pre-ontology, a conditions for belief, and that Taylor talks about, the conditions for experiencing ourselves as human beings in the present is predicated upon this temporal intensification, this sense of a warming condition, which is one of these phenomena of temporal consciousness, of integral consciousness pressing forward to be recognized. Yes, I see Dragpa. Would you like to jump in?
Wow, thanks, Jeremy. You're bringing it. This is badass. So I only know Gebser pretty much through Wilber's references, and I only know your work, unfortunately, since like this morning, which is so sad because I know I've missed out on a lot here. Just spending this 30 minutes with your presentation and you. The atmosphere, you've really done a beautiful job of actually opening the atmosphere for this kind of permeating, ever-present origin kind of access that allows this complexity of time dynamics to be here. So really, I deeply appreciate that. And it really reminds me of some recent things that have come up in, I think you know this person, Brant Stickley and Heiner Fruhoff. And they're doing integral dynamics with Chinese medicine modalities and healing and kind of, it's like, what happens when you allow the presence to actually be like a living fountain of real-time complexity dynamics of the kind of Vervaekian agent of like gelling like in present right now. It's kind of like how to do that. Okay, it's like, so here's my question. How to allow that presencing, which is so like lusciously intermeshed and shaped and like literally the output of this time congealing. How do you do that? And at the same time, have enough skillful kind of like sensitivity or relevance recognition or to know what of the kind of infinite complexity dynamics to really tune in with in order to have the most kind of resonant co-play experience with that moment?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you. That's the $1 million question. What I haven't gone into too much is wherever Gebser is talking about this, maybe with the exception of the complexity that he was pointing to in that statement, he always refers to the integral as senseful, and I'll type it in the chat, the term senseful. And this is great with Brandt, right? Like if you're in a healing modality, there's a somatic groundedness in the integral consciousness, which is not like, we move kind of up into the head when we think of the mental, and then we think, okay, the integral is even more mental, right? There's even more complexity that we have to grasp. It's not, it's a turning towards a sort of whole field. So it might exhibit itself as mental complexity when Gebser's using that paragraph to describe it, but it's also very much a groundedness in relationship with the present. So what is the present asking for? Where is our attention being directed? What is most prescient and latent and pressing forth to be realized, to be in relationship with us? So I've always talked about this, and I talk about this in the book I'm working on right now, Fragments of an Integral Future, that especially in the context, but very often this is the case, but especially in the case of the integral structure, transformation, worldview transformation looks like reversal. And I think very often we think of the integral structure as the next higher stage, but the integral is breaking that whole spatial alignment, right? It's saying that we're folding back into interrelationship with the whole. So it's a kind of, to borrow from my friend Matt Segal's book, a descendental turn in a way, right? There's a turning back to the interrelationship with the whole. So it's senseful, it's grounded, it's not characteristically abstract. And if we're looking to how to live it in the day-to-day, it's oriented towards presence. And in the present, that kind of complexity, when we're in a grounded relationship with it, is lived rather than represented in a conceptual way, right? So easier said than done, of course, especially as moderns. But this is the kind of redirectional current, right? It's a returning towards a relationship with the whole and what's already present in us and those living dynamics, which means the characteristic abstraction is this one facet. And when it's in relationship to that sense of intensified presence and anchoredness in the present, I think we do complexity better. We think better even. Thinking itself is now in relationship with what it is thinking about. And that is not characteristically very, it's been hard to do that. And some of Malm's writing earlier in that book, he's talking about Jameson and these historical trends in the postmodern. There's a sort of de-worlding and moving away from a concretized relationship with the world, with time, with locality. We've moved from place to space. This is a return to place, right? Without losing the abstraction of space. So I hope that kind of helps the sort of, the kind of directional move here, the kind of zigzagging or back flipping that's going on with the integral mutation. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Ishan. Yeah. Right.
Hello there. So I had been, first time, going inside, too deep inside the Jean Gebser. And it is amazing like how she describes time, and it's somewhat kind of a metaphysical and a philosophical kind of way she describes time as a whole. So looking as time as a whole on itself. So we, after the westernization of the whole globe and the spreading of the sciences around the globe, what happens is like we have been too much attached with the, this physical reality to the extent that we are unable to see like the actual reality, the space-time fabric and how we as humans live as a consciousness on this planet. And this time as a dimension and whole, as a whole on itself, and how it transcends and includes each moment to moment to moment is such a beautiful thing, and how it folds out. And Jean Gesber, it has been, I've never heard that, from the Jean Gesber itself, her descriptions of, this thing, and it has been amazing.
Thank you, Ishan. Was there a question there other than like, I agree, it is quite of an amazing way to engage with time in the living present. It's even the mechanism, right, of transcendent include, it doesn't quite touch the sense of well, to Nomali's point in helping me name this, like always already, there's like a sense of extension, past, present, future, an inclusion already, a living relationship. I've had to, in my new book, move towards other images and metaphors to try to touch on that, right, without losing the reader. But I've moved to, and we were talking about this in my Patreon call on this Wednesday, images of rhizomes and mycelia, images of forest floors and networks, right? If we're going to think about time in a spatial metaphor, let's at least give it an ecological one, a relational one, a one that actually shows the back and forth living interrelationships of the whole, right? So the weaving of time is something that's is quite ancient. Saint Augustine talked about that, with the gathering time, but he kind of saved that for what God did, right? God gathers up time in the eternal. But the integral structure, there's a similar sense of the gathering up of past, present, and future, and constellating its interrelationships. This is both a poetic sense, but it's also, I think, for anybody who does history and is thinking about history and how particular moments are entangled in other ones because of their import, because of their meaning that's constellated. That's a way, I think, of engaging with this sort of gathered time, the transcending or the including and gathering up of time in this fourth dimension, or I don't know what we would call it, time free.
Has been very much less discovered by the people like us on the planet. And time, is it is like space has all dimensions, and it has multiple dimensions. Similarly, time. So all of the time that exists as all together, like past, present, and future. And there are various researches on parapsychology that extremely explain that psychic phenomenon that happens when one goes inside the subjective dimension, that interior individual first quadrant, and can access the psychic abilities, can view past, present, future, can do remote viewing and such type of abilities. And that is the time itself, that is the time space dimension, which is completely unexplored. And it is an amazing thing which is possible.
Yes, definitely. There's really interesting. Gebser speaks to that a little bit too in EPO, just a bit. But thank you, Ishan. That's also a very interesting field that I think is being corroborated with this intuitive poetic sense of the interrelationship. The fun thing, and I'll jump to Phyllis in a second, the fun thing about this work as a sort of inexhaustible research area is temporics is applicable to the climate crisis, is applicable to physics, is applicable to living in a more ecological relationship with the present and place. It's applicable to our spiritual ancestral work. So time can be this sort of multifaceted jewel of practice, scholarship, academics. So it's endlessly fascinating topic. So thank you, Ishan.
Thank you.
Okay, Phyllis, would you like to jump in?
It's exquisite to listen to you speaking about this. I mean, it's really the whole idea of looking at time as this, accumulation of what has come before and what is to be in this present moment. What I'm wondering is, when I've looked at time in the past, there have been these paradigm shifts, these fulcrums, where things sort of are no longer in any kind of linear or web-like. They're paradigm shifts. Things absolutely change. And when you're talking about moving forward and moving back in the same breath, where do those paradigm shifts, those fulcrums lay?
Yeah, good question. I would say the fun thing about this is that those chironic moments, those moments in which transformation is to be seized and seizes us, those dramatic moments of worldview transformation are themselves, if we look at them, architected in this sort of rhizomatic and networked way, right? There's resonance with the past in these moments that comes to the fore. I would say, the climate crisis today is woven in with that moment with James Watt and the innovation of the steam engine, right? So these moments themselves seem to gather up time, right? Significant, important figures constellating from the past and our own relationship with the future. These moments of transformation seem to be a bit more transparent, right? A bit more translucent to those other historical periods. There's an interesting quote, I forget who it is, the sci-fi author, who's writing about the 1960s and the kind of revolutionary spirit of the 60s. And the way he describes it is, it seemed as if there was an infinite present with all of these different possibilities and a sense of the future as well. But then as the decade passed and we moved into the 70s, he says, the future seemed to vanish and recede. So there's a sense of the future in the present, which can kind of malleably recede. I think those moments where we feel the presence of the future, when we feel a kind of creative continuation with the past, those moments that are chironic are really good examples of these worldview fulcrum points of dramatic transformation. But also it's not linear as well. I think we go through a few of those. We kind of go forwards and then we go back and it seems to recede, and then it happens elsewhere, and then constellating all of those moments, we begin to shift our worldview. So I would say it's sort of, even with worldview transformation, they're distributed across space and time. And there are moments that are particularly more translucent to the future and what we are becoming than others. So does that make sense? I'm just sort of describing the quality of those transformational times.
Yeah, I love the way that you're talking about it in terms of kairos and in terms of it being that moment that feels like it's so right. And if the thing emerges at that moment, then it's magic. And if it doesn't, it's gone. And literature captures that, art captures that. It's so difficult for words to for this conversation to capture that, but when you bring up the 60s and you bring up that period of time, it's like there was this incredible sense of what was to come. And then people were assassinated one after another, people were picked off one after another. And so that moment dissolved. And so it's just fascinating to look at it in terms of this kind of schema. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Phyllis. One other point just to bring up about this too is our sense of the future, the history of the future is a really interesting subject to look at in the 20th century. And if you look at a lot of early 20th century writers, there is this more palpable sense that the next century is going to be even more fantastical than this one, that things will continue to transform in one direction, right? Which is better and better. That felt sense of the future as progress has dramatically receded from, I think, my generation is millennials and certainly the Gen Z. There is no felt sense of the future as being better. There is now a sense of, it might sound depressing to talk about or cynical, but it's not. It's our felt sense. There's a felt sense that the future is a transformation, but it's not this linear one anymore. There is a sense of climate becoming very, very important, a sense of crisis looming on the horizon of tomorrow. And with that, though, there is a new sense of time. And this is what I've continuing to argue that this new relationship with the future, not as catastrophe, not just as collapse, but the future as malleable, time as malleable. The future continues to change, as well as the past in terms of our own paradigms of what we understood to happen in history. I would say this is more descriptive of the general sense of time in the integral worldview, is that it is malleable and it is shape-shifting. And the dark side of that, of course, is, okay, well, that means the future can get worse. But the positive side of that is we are far more participatory in our relationship with those conditions, those complex conditions, that we are involved in the co-shaping of past and future. That's the upside, right? That's the constructive, creative side that I think the integral mutation is latently bringing forth, if we can realize it in a more constructive way, right? Rather than a catastrophic way. That's sort of our invitation and initiation, I think, in this moment. Yeah, thank you, Phyllis. Great question. Jack, would you like to jump in?
Yeah. What comes to mind is, it seemed like a good idea at the time. You know? Yeah, getting these steamships going seemed like a good, burning coal seemed like a good idea at the time. Anyway, but my analogy that I've been thinking about, that maybe you could help me with, or whatever, is the idea. It's pretty geometrical, but it's the idea, if you start at a point, if you have perspective of not looking at a point but being a point, that's pretty limited, right? And the next higher perspective would be a line, and a line could sort of imagine going through points, and that's pretty cool, right? And then a line perpendicular to that, orthogonal to that, now all of a sudden can maybe even look back and see the line, the other line that was orthogonal to it, if you can imagine that a little bit, although looking back really couldn't happen on a plane, right? And then you've got this third dimensional thing which can zoom off in another orthogonal direction and sort of look at this whole flat map, or this whole flat plane, right? And then you've got another dimension which we'll call time, which can look at this space in a way that the space really couldn't look at itself, right? So if you're following that, my question would be, what's orthogonal to time? Because if we don't find something that's orthogonal to time and look from there, we're stuck in time. In the same way we'd be stuck in space or a flat land or whatever dimension we're coming from. So what would you say, if you think this is a reasonable analogy, a metaphor, whatever, would be something that could be orthogonal to time, or something that's even orthogonal to something that's orthogonal to time, depending on how you want to think about it. So just thought I'd throw that out there.
Well, thanks, Jack. That's fun. Yeah, and as we were saying earlier, dimensionality is one helpful way, right? Because Gebser uses the fourth dimension to speak to the integral all the time in EPO and elsewhere. But here's an interesting thing, that what might be orthogonal to time, and this is just a playful conceptual exercise as a way to begin to imagine, would be the fifth dimension, or what Gebser would describe as something synonymous with origin, what gathers up time itself, not being stuck in time, but free from time. Remember the alpha privativum prefix for Gebser, where he's saying the integral structure is not just time, not just past, present, future in interrelationship, but that which gathers up time. So whatever that dimension might be, whatever that orthogonal dimension is, Gebser describes it as origin, right? We might describe it in more Buddhist terms as maybe emptiness. There's a way in which Gebser uses interesting contemplative language, and I wonder if he was sensing into this in a more experiential way, where he describes, we talked about this in the last session, that openness of the open sky, and the integral structure is a sort of openness to hold all of it. But he says that openness is not a negative emptiness, it's a full emptiness. He describes it as a plenum. So we might be saying, yeah, this originary consciousness, this originary dimension, which bring forth time and space, is what's orthogonal to time. And Gebser's a little blurry when it comes to that. He's using integral as the fourth dimension, but he's also saying it's the realization, the conscious realization and transparency of origin in the human being, that consciousness in the human being. So there's a bit of a spectrum there we can start to look at. The fourth dimension into, is it the fifth? Is it origin? Is it the spiritual? The language starts to get a little murky there in some of Gebser's writing. He wasn't a theologian, nor was he necessarily a scientist creating a very strict schematic. But I hope that's is at least a bit helpful, because there is a sense of time freedom, is what he talks about in his language. Freedom from and freedom for the various realizations of time and space is what integral consciousness is, and what origin in the human being is. Does that help?
And anything that might be orthogonal to that origin?
I don't know what's orthogonal to God or the emptiness or the Tao. I'm not sure.
I
But
did
that's
have another question for you. One thing that's helped me, I think, I don't know if it was you that wrote or someone talked about mankind's relationship to the moon at various levels of consciousness. Would you be willing to talk about that a little bit? That I remember that really helping me. And I got up to a certain point, like, okay, we're on the moon now. Where do we go from? Where do we go from there?
I don't know if I wrote about that specifically, but it's an interesting. I mean, we could play with that a little bit with just the sort of magic mythic relationship with the moon as a celestial body, which involves us in its particular waxing and waning movements, or the psychical participation in the moon, and then of course the mental perspectival world, seeing the moon as a three-dimensional object in space, right? There's a new relationship with it there. But I like a lot of folks to talk about the moon landing and looking back at Earth as this interesting reversal. And this is again what I write about in my next book, that the moment of being on the moon was not a moment to leap out into the cosmos in a one-directional progress. It was turning back towards the Earth in a new relationship with home and origins, in a way that it was no longer sufficient to see the Earth as an object, right? We have to come back and participate in it, in the world. We move away from the Cartesian grid or the spatialization of the cosmos, and more towards kind of images we have today with, let's say, like hyper complicated, like I showed in some of my slides, very complex topologies from the satellite, all the different rivulets and different systems and geological strata, which show up at a glance, looking down on the Earth from space. That's the kind of complexity we're beginning to roll in. That's the medium and the message of jumping out into space and looking back, right? That worldview transformation again.
So it's as much the looking back. I get it now. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Yeah, great questions. Okay, Eric, would you like to jump in?
Great. Hi, Jeremy. Nice to meet you. And before I forget, Jack, in the chat, there's a YouTube video that your comments brought to mind called The 10 Dimensions that kind of explores a little bit about what you're talking about, if you want to check that out. So, Jeremy, the question that I have for you is, I have been thinking about time in a very similar context on my own last few years, just my relationship to the past and what it means for the future and how these two converge in this ever-going presence. My question to you is, what's the role of technology in all of this? I'm assuming this is like a both and sort of argument, but do you feel like it hinders our ability to understand presence? Because, when we're watching, content on social media, it's really technically in the past, and then there's a future implication. So do you think it helps or hinders, or what do you think?
Yeah, good question. It's always a complicated answer. I'm definitely a McLuhanist or a media ecologist in that sense, that technology always is never neutral. It's always shaping us. It's always shaping the conditions for experience, right, as we shape it. So I love to look at technology as crystallizations of worldview. How is the perspectival world and the mental structure of consciousness showing up in the technological environment we create for ourselves? And it's showing up very specifically in those ways. It feeds into the time crisis that we're having in terms of algorithms sort of atomizing the human being and incentivizing and turning us into kind of commodities, right? So there's an atomization of the self. There's technological fragmentation with the splicing of worldviews. There's a de-worlding and a de-spacing in a negative sense that I think a lot of our technological world is doing today, right? It's the phenomena of like the flat earther on finding YouTube videos and going down this sort of rabbit hole. It's a perspectival rather than an aperspectival madness. It's a perspectival turned upon itself. But but it's also, I think, showing the different phenomena of the integral structure, right? It's eliminating that difference between spaces, right? It's bringing the world into a single point. It's interconnecting things. It's allowing us to think in more networked ways. So I would say technology just generally is a very good embodiment and exemplification of our worldview crisis. It's both expressing the old worldview and attempting to capture the new within itself and creating all sorts of crises because of it. It's a mirror and a reflection of ourselves in so many ways, and our various struggles right now, just between the integral and the mental, if we were to sort of simplify those tensions. Does that help kind of answer, give a general field sense of how I would start to look at that?
Yeah, and I know Zach Stein has written about the idea of intergenerational interruption, that the passing down of knowledge in the late 1800s. John Dewey spoke about how we really went from an apprenticeship, community-based way of being to schooling, and schooling was an abstract idea that if you learned how to read, write, and do math, you could have success by finding work that would pay higher than a local community. So it really shifted our culture in a lot of ways. And now things are so hyper technical. So a lot of my work criticizes STEM education, particularly because within this pipeline, it does, for the most part, remove the humanities because there's no time for it. So that's where I'm kind of looking into, how can the integral community with this technology, and I hate to use the word compete because that's not really what I'm going for, but maybe compete and collaborate. But technology is used to sell goods on the market. I mean, at the end of the day, it drives our activity and our purchasing power. So how can integral communities, maybe like what we're doing here, but in a way influence culture that can not just have people think I'll just consume more integral on the internet and on social media, but it really does bring them into that sense of being that I think you're getting at, which is like there's a whole other level of depth that we kind of miss. So
yeah, exactly. I think it really depends on the worldview of the culture that's producing and working with the tech. In so many ways, the first individuating move we often don't do, right? And I see so much with like the analysis of technological crises. There's a sort of a reifying of technology as the problem, and not looking at how technology, you can trace it down to these more fundamental worldview orientations which impress themselves and shape those technological decision making, right? The forms of time that we prioritize in terms of designing our tech, the market forces, which are very, in the Gebserian sense, perspectival and mental, rational in a deficient sense, right? Like driven in a one-directional way towards markets, right? We're not really working with time in a different way when we work with technology. It's sort of a given. So I think the first step is really to kind of become aware of the sea in which we swim, right? The worldview crisis we're inhabiting and exhibiting, or else we're kind of stuck in this loop of blaming technology and then trying to invent new technology to counter it. We're not really getting to the sort of structural roots, right? The consciousness-oriented roots, the ontological roots of the crisis. So what can that look like? I think that's a really interesting question. How can technology serve this transformation of reversal, of getting us in connection with each other, defending us against atomization, right? Encouraging healthy forms of the different structures of consciousness, and then also encouraging a more complex experience of time. And that's not just a mental experience of time, but a relational, space-based, regenerative-oriented one, in terms of like getting us back at a human level with each other and a more than human level with each other. These are really interesting questions. Can technology aid a different sort of market economy that's a slowing down, right? Or a more rhythmic economy, or more of a loop-oriented economy? These are really interesting questions. And I think, Gebser's analysis, unfortunately, is written in the 1940s, but I think as a good example, he's taking the kind of criteria for these worldview, these structures of consciousness, and looking at everything going on in his time economics, architecture, et cetera, to really see how that structure, the integral structure is showing up, or how that transformation is showing up. So I think what we would need to do in our time is a similar kind of analysis, like what are the integral conditions? What are the conditions of the integral consciousness? How do we intensify and embolden them in our technological, social, educational worlds, right? And how do we kind of stay anchored in that as a kind of not exactly a bastion, but a sort of a robust ecological and resilient niche, right? That we're kind of holding down and attempting to grow and propagate. I'm moving into ecological metaphors, but my mind goes there. But yeah, I hope that's
like what you said, the rhythmic economy. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, great question. Excellent. And I think we got another 25 minutes or so, right? Okay, perfect. Great. We have plenty of time for questions. Excellent. Drakpa, you want to come back around?
Sweet, thanks. So I had a question about something I thought this morning. I'm like calling it the Sean S. Bjorn Hargen's Invisible Wall. And it's about when we begin to relate to or play with or see through or worldview through alternative ontologies like exo studies or non-human or non-dominant monad paradigms. So what you're talking about here is this interweaving. It's like a seamless interweaving of past, present, future, and this eternal origin moment. And it's very destabilizing. It's definitely in one way an alternative ontological way of framing this. I mean, at Gebserian, and I guess yours too. So my question is we keep like pushing into those outer edges or deeper connections that really open into kind of like a richer enfolding of time and space, that in Wilberian sense, like what previous thought of or like seen as a deep structure that was invariable, all of a sudden from this alternative ontology, it becomes a variant too. It's a node we can select for or not, depending on whether it's helpful to envelop more things and weave them together in a more beautiful, rich, integrally informed way. And that's kind of a wall to edge into that whatever this might be opening into. And so the question is for you, and possibly for Gebser too, but I'm more curious about for you, where do you anticipate that you're really gonna be shocked or surprised in terms of the really beautiful emergent side of what is the updraft of the future, kind of like asking us to include more? Where do you think you're gonna be surprised with that?
Oh, I'm surprised. Every few years I go through little shocks and awes with okay, I will say one thing that has been true for me again and again. It is, and this has come up in the book last year, the essay I was working on the nature of reversal and transformation. But experientially, when you bring back the past structures, when you work to reintegrate the past mutations, the archaic, magic, mythic, in yourself, in your daily life, I was surprised to find that they start to look like the future, that they inherit the future, which is really interesting. And it's not regression. It's not like, okay, bring back the mythic. It's going to be a mythic future. We're going to go medieval. Like, no, it like goes through a radical transformation, a metamorphosis. The magic reimagines itself in the present. And I think of this in like, this has been fantastic to see this and learn about this these past few years in biology and just biological evolution, how the morphology of the body will just take its structures and then use them for completely different things. Bones reshaping to be used for completely different things, right? I'm thinking of, did we use this already? The cephalopod example last time? I don't know if I mentioned it. That cephalopods, right? Squid, octopi, they all used to have exterior shells. in the ancient oceans. And when fish began to evolve, their lack of mobility became a sort of a crisis point where they needed to adapt and become faster. So essentially what they ended up doing is taking their shell and flipping it inside out. So the shell became a bone in the center of their body. Interesting, they call it the gladius in some of these organisms. Looks like a beautiful bone-like feather, right? So literally the body of the past of the ancestors becomes the body of the future, completely repurposed. So I'm always just dazzled by the different ways the magic and the mythic show up in modernity and reimagine our relationship with the secular and the modern, and also the integral. Gebser has this beautiful line about the mythic structure, the possibility of the mythic structure, if we become diaphanous to origin in the integral, might become hyper illuminated. So this image of the hyper illuminated mythic icon is such an interesting possibility for the future. So yeah, how does the past surprise us as it reimagines itself to meet the future, or is the face of the future? It's just lovely little topsy-turvy moments like that I've been having these past few years. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Could I do a quick follow-up?
Sure, yeah.
So then a hopeful part of that is that everything, or the process will go wrong if we unbundle it too much from the origin and from its context, from the ecologies that it's in, whether it's a person or a community, that any place and time we are has enough for us to have this unfolding happen. But we have to stay in place and in time, like in connection and relationship to that context, to that ecology, to that living me and you and us. We have to stay long enough without jumping or speeding up in order for that shell acceptation to actually repurpose itself. Because if we bounce too early or we watch the video too fast, the atmosphere to actually resonate with the origin is occluded. So
Exactly. You have to slow down to speed up. In that kind of paradoxical statement, slow down, be in relationship in the present, that actually creates those sorts of quote unquote shortcuts to the future, to that metamorphosis. And to Gebser's point about the senseful relationship of embodying integral consciousness, it really does invite us back into being in relationship with place and time, and to recognize there's no other place but place and time, no other place for that transformation to concretize itself with being in relationship in the present. So that, yeah, there's that wonderful turning in, slowing down. What is a bioacumul, I call it, a slow urgency. There's this really interesting relationship with time that the integral is affording us. And I think for us as well, as a sort of answer to the climate crisis, just in a very brute mechanical way, like slowing down actually does tremendous transformational work. Ceasing our activities is transformational, and this is the beginning of it. So I think, those sorts of investigations. Thank you. Fantastic. Okay, yeah, Phyllis.
Neither my science or my philosophy is quite up to the question that I'm going to ask, but I'm curious. There have been these photos that are coming from outer space, where these new telescopes are able to see further back in time than the Big Bang. And in that seeing further back, there's a sense that the concept of the Big Bang may in fact be something that will change, and there's a relationship between that I don't quite understand, that measures the distance back in terms of space, but really it measures it in terms of the time that it takes for the light to get here. And if you look at the construct, if you look at it that way, then it kind of makes sense that we're in the middle of something, not an end point of something that started back then, but in the middle of something that continues, you know, and I was just wondering how that science fits into, if you're looking at that science in terms of how you're looking at time and space right now.
That's a great question. I can probably only answer as a poet. When it comes to physics, I'm less and less sense of competency in what I can articulate.
I prefer a poetic answer.
Okay. But yeah, that's a great question. Nevertheless, what Gebser says about, and this is the sort of poetic spiritual insight on the nature of origin. Origin, and this is actually, maybe this would be a good moment to just read the opening of the text paragraph, because he says in the preface, right, this is the page I was speaking to when I was reading on the train, opening lines, origin is ever present. It is not a beginning, since all beginning is linked with time, and the present is not just the now, today, the moment or unit of time. It is ever originating, an achievement of full integration and continuous renewal. There's a theological sense in that like the world is being brought into being moment to moment, that we're in the middle of it, from what I'm hearing. There's not a point that's a beginning, an origin point. It's a sort of unthinkable, ever renewing process that we're just in the middle of, right? If that ends up being kind of corroborated by physics, I'll be delighted, you know. But in terms of my own contemplative inklings and poetic theological inklings, I would say like that's how I would understand origin as ever originating, right? And this is the potency, I think, of the integral structure for us is turning towards the present, is turning towards things coming into being moment to moment, right? Very contemplative, I think, in the languaging there. I think there's corroboration with mystical teachings and various contemplative writings on the bringing forth of origin moment to moment. So that's where I would go. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but it sounds like that's what the physicists are talking about. So I would be delighted. And Ishana, I'm gonna go to you in a moment. I'm just gonna, I know we got about 13 minutes left, so I just wanna pop on the screen just a little note, just so you have it on your screens. But for the class, just as a reminder before we all hop off the call at the bottom of the hour. Yeah, just a quick note about the Gebser course coming up, Seeing Through the World, Integral Consciousness in the Ever-Present Origin. It's a 9-week course, and it starts on Tuesday, March 7th. And what we're going to be doing is not reading through the Ever-Present Origin, but I'm going to be giving a series of 45-minute or so lectures, and then 45-minute Q&A on Tuesdays. Then we're going to have an office hours every week, and then also a session that's inspired by collective presencing, where there'll be a group, we'll be exploring the different structures of consciousness in a sort of experiential, collective, contemplative way. And so it's going to be an intensive container between March going into the very beginning of May, weekly sessions, and you can attend them live or not if you want. But the idea for me this time is not to have us read through the Ever-Present Origin chapter by chapter. Instead, I'm going to be drawing a series of distillations from the text, a series of principles and themes in each of these lectures. So it'll be much more engaged and dynamic, and not just reading and falling behind on the reading. I know all of us are quite busy these days. And if you do decide to read along with the class, that would also be fantastic, but it's in no way a mandate. So if you're daunted by that, you can also just take the course and listen to the lessons and glean things that way as well. And that's going to be the primary way. There'll be 9 modules, each one with a different theme. So just, yeah, you can find that in the chat, I believe. I will just repost that link. And you can also find, in terms of my contact, my email's in there, my Twitter's there, my newsletter's there. So if you want to catch up and connect with me after this session, if you have questions, if you're utterly confused, if you have serious problems with my presentation, reach out to me. Okay. Yeah, Ishan, if you'd like to jump back in. So I think you're still muted.
Okay, so yeah, So while talking with Dragpa, you put up the point of going back to the archaic, mythic, and magic stages. I do relate, I do understand the correlation of these stages with the energy centers, like archaic with the lowest chakra and magic with the mythic with the heart chakra. But what do you refer to going back to these structures? Are they intended to clearing those chakras, or are they intended to be of conscious use of these energy centers, of structures of consciousness?
That's a good question. I'm not as an expert on this. There have been Gebserians that have correlated the structures with the chakras. As far as Gebser's,
you can relate with levels, it would be understandable. No issues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gebser does associate the archaic. I don't remember what he associates it with the magic, the soma, and the gut. With the mythic, it's the heart. With the mental, it's the head. So not quite the same alignment, but with the integral, he says it's the vertex, which I think is like the top of the head. But the idea of it being global, right? A kind of field or spherical interrelationship of all of the senses. And earlier we talked about the magic also being associated with auditory senses, so acoustic, oral cultures. The mythic, more heart-centered and imagistic, psychical, right? More of like the inner world, the unconscious, as it were. The dreaming life, right? The psychical soul life, the inner life of the soul. So, and then the mental, of course, being much more in the head, directed, spatial. So you might connect it with the eyes, right? Spatialization of moving around in three-dimensional space. And the integral kind of, you lose the particular sense organ association, and you end up getting a whole sensory field that the integral is expressing itself through. Does that help a little bit, just in terms of maybe it's sort of models of how to ground it a bit in the body, in the individual body?
I wanted to understand what was your way when you said like going back to the stages were helpful.
Yeah.
In what sense?
Well, I think just getting a living sense of how the earlier structures are shaping our day-to-day experience. We move through magic and mythic and mental every day. They're all interrelated in our I don't know, you may have a particularly intuitive moment sensing something about the day, or somebody about to call you, right? Or a gut sense about things. And if you just pay attention to the way the gut sense is experienced, it's sort of, it's not thinking about something, it just is reacting to a thing as if it's woven into the world and responding to what's happening, right? It's a kind of a prescient relationship with our world, right? And sometimes with time, sensing something's going to happen, sensing a sense of danger, sensing something about somebody, right? And the mythic, you know, it has this other relationship with time as well. The way our dreaming life might be, I always relate the mythic to the way that plants grow. The way that if you're tending to a garden, particular flowerings or particular weeds or particular organisms will show up in the garden that day and shift the relationship. The more than humans always sort of slowly talking with you, it's giving you feedback in quiet ways, and our psyche does that, right? So there's a sort of slowing down and listening that the mythic kind of it encourages you to do. And as a practitioner, as an integral practitioner, what we can do is move through the different structures of consciousness as we can embody them in our day-to-day lives, right? And that's the prerequisite for the integral, is to kind of go, all right, the magic, the mythic, the mental are all sort of an interplay. And in the middle of all of that, there is this sense of the whole, that if we bring enough attention to the present and the interrelationship with these different expressions of who we are, right, our integrum, it begins to sort of shine forth.
As a kind of exercising those capacities too.
Yes, exactly. So
amazing.
Yes, thank you, Ishan. Any other questions? We got 6 minutes, so I don't know if anyone wants to jump in. Questions, confusions, challenges?
Well, I would just say, Jeremy, thank you so much. And I hope that maybe you'll come back. I know you're going into your course and you'll be busy, but maybe when you have time again to come and do anything else that your heart desires, you are always welcome here, Jeremy, and always an open door, whether it's Gebser or anything else. I know you're also doing the other project called the Integral Left. Is that what you call it? Yeah.
Yeah, not so much a project, but it's just I've been and putting stuff out there. I might be doing that as the political season ramps up.
Yeah. So yeah, well, there's an invitation to discuss the Integral Left as well. Yeah.
Oh, that'd be exciting. if you're inviting me in, I'd be happy to do it. Yeah.
I'll just very quickly share my screen with everyone who's here, just super quickly, just to give you a sense of some of the stuff that's upcoming. And there's a couple of politically inspired sessions you can, oops, did I just stop sharing? Jeff Salzman will have these fireside chats on politics, and then Jeremy, your friend Ryan will be doing meta-ideological politics also. So I think, yes, the political season is definitely ramping up. So I think we would love to have you come back and engage that, and obviously anything else that is inspiring to you that you'd like to share. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to Ryan's presentation. We used to co-host that podcast Growing Down for a bit during the last political cycle. So I'm sure interesting collaborations will be afoot. And for somebody who was just asking too, I left a link to, I don't know if you meant my book, first book, Mary, but I left a link to Seeing Through the World, this one right here, if you're curious. It's meant to be an introduction to the ever-present origin. So it's sort of the text version of the class that I'm about to do, in my own words, Gebser in my own words, as it were. And yeah, please do stay in touch. If you're curious, follow my Substack for weekly updates. I would love to come back and just talk about integral consciousness in the present, what's going on in culture. How do we lean into that as a way to deepen our understanding of what this integral mutation is in day-to-day life? So thank you, Namali. It's been quite a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. Good luck to you with your course, and I hope that some of you will actually join Jeremy in taking that course. Thank you. So maybe we can all, maybe we can all unmute ourselves and offer a voice with a gratitude and a thank you to Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thanks, speaker.
So enjoyed your talk.
Thanks so much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Very good.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you all. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.
Beautiful.